The Idries Shah Foundation podcast. Practical Psychology for Today. Featuring the works of Idries Shah, voiced by David Ault. Welcome to the Idries Shah Foundation podcast. In this edition of the podcast, we will hear selections from A Perfumed Scorpion by Idries Shah. This audio has been made available by the Idries Shah Foundation. Simplification. It certainly is my own experience that when real Sufi definitions are made and understood, the understanding of the Sufi development and path by the student become enormously easier. But we may have to wait until enough psychologists and other researchers want higher consciousness more than they need emotional stabilization, or elegant monographs to their names, for there to be significant numbers willing to undertake this higher range of real Sufi study. And a consequent widespread availability of this kind of knowledge. As a piece of applied psychology, it is worth noting that people who want Sufi ideas simplified for them do not, in frequently repeated experience, show an increase in understanding following such simplification. And yet, if they are first taught Sufi exercises enabling them to concentrate better, they do not need any intellectual activity, such as breaking down of elusive concepts into simplistic grotesques or penny packets, to understand them with relative ease. You might say that it is not always wise to ask the patient to prescribe for himself, especially if you are a doctor. Similarly, before assuming that you are talking too softly, as someone may claim, also investigate whether he needs to wash out his ears. Teaching, one must repeat, is to give what the learner really needs. You may have heard the story which puts, in a nutshell, the distortion and failure to communicate which many attempts at simplification can produce. A certain Sufi was in the habit of making what seemed to his hearers to be disjointed utterances. He did this because it was through just such behaviour that he had himself learnt from his own teacher, and because he was trying to communicate with a conventionally minded scholar. But the scholar could make no sense of what the Sufi was saying or doing, or whatever was going on. He constantly begged him to be more specific, to describe his experiences lucidly, to delineate the truths which he saw with far greater precision, and so on. Our kind-hearted mystic, uncharacteristically for his trade, but necessarily for the development of this story, tried and tried and tried. Finally, when his thoughts were verbally marshalled in the most organized way imaginable, he wrote it all down. This long, impassioned but grammatical account of his deepest experiences was sent, together with a sketch of the whole manner of its attaining, to the scholar. The manuscript came back next day from the desk of the man of learning, with this comment written upon it. The admitted increase in your ability to express yourself has, however, only succeeded in revealing the inadequacies of your logic. The scholar was not ready to see that the Sufi was showing him what happened to instrumental material reprocessed into logic. The Sufi assertion is that the teacher, the teaching, and the taught must be in harmony and in alignment. Otherwise, only distortions leading to occult or other low-level stabilization are most likely to be the result. The cultists, both in East and West, although they have access to the classical and authoritative Sufi texts giving these warnings, suppress them. With the Sufi way, its psychology in action requires that certain exercises, such as concentration and also diffusion of attention, for instance, must be kept in balance. How, when, and with whom? A major factor additional to the need to prepare the learner for the mystical experience, which takes forms not yet even noted in the West, is that of how, when, and where, and with whom the necessary development may be carried out. The consciousness must be attuned in accordance with a knowledge of the possibilities. This is what distinguishes real, traditional Sufi teaching from the forms in which exercises are just handed out randomly. An Indian story illustrates this need for proper measure in psychology, as in nutrition. It is about a man who went to a restaurant and ordered curry and rice. It was a long time coming, and as he was very hungry, he asked what was holding things up. "Well, sir, the curry is ready, but the rice is not." "Very well," he said. "Bring me the curry to start on, and I'll have the rice later." They brought the curry, but he was so hungry that he had finished it up before the rice arrived. As he ate his way through the plain boiled rice, when it did come, he found it hard going, and he asked for some more curry to go with it. So they started to cook some more curry, but of course by the time it was ready the rice was eaten up, and he had to order more rice to go with that. The curry was hot. Before the two elements, as it were, got into phase, he hated the sight of both curry and rice. Apart from the quite imaginable correspondence of the rice with the left hemisphere of the brain and the curry with the right, I invoke this tale to say to you that the Sufi way of thought has been called too structured by some and insufficiently coherent by others. And I invoke it to emphasize that curry and rice complement one another, and that principle is central to Sufi work. To the Sufi, failure to observe this is equivalent to the behaviour of someone who blames a surgeon as inconsistent because he had been observed sometimes to take things out of a human body and sometimes to put things in. It is partly due to this special usage of techniques through feel and not slavishly by a textbook, as well as the relative shortcomings of the surrounding culture's information stock, that many confusing legends in many countries developed about Sufis over the centuries. Both these factors, and also the numerous imitators and self-imagined Sufis have, since the earliest recorded times in this tradition, muddled the public's understanding of the Sufi. But the Sufis have always survived it. Indeed, they are able to make use of it by contrasting primitive and sensationalist thought and activity with the real thing, as I am doing at this very moment. There are many other factors which Sufi knowledge indicates as barriers to learning, and also many which distinctly facilitate it. That some of this material is put into poetry, into teaching tales, or embodied into actual instructional situations or records of them, does not make the study any easier for people who are unfamiliar with these modes of presentation as containing a dynamic, not just to be consumed. Teaching stories, for instance, require careful interaction study as part of a comprehensive course, constantly monitored to assess progress and to encourage it, if their usefulness is to be exploited beyond a certain point. Our publishing, over the past 10 years, of several hundreds of these stories, has ensured their wide currency for entertainment. But it has also enabled us to contact those who have appreciated inner dimensions in them without the need for further work. The attempt, by opportunists, to build them into various existing systems and esoteric philosophies has stimulated the questions as to how they really are to be employed, which has enabled us to prepare for the next stage in this psychological enterprise. They cannot just be adopted and fed into arbitrary frames. We have deliberately held back from premature interpretation to frustrate the pirating of material by incompetence and worse. Themes and cultural context. The system of the Sufis, if I can use that word for it, is constantly manifested in different forms in accordance with local cultures. It is not regarded as the consequence of research, but as the application of experience to specific conditions. The Sufi experience is, to the Sufi, cosmic and hence extra-dimensional, humanity having the capacity to perceive that which is beyond the range of conventionally experienced physics. But since the Sufi has the experience, he can devise the means of returning to it, and if he is a teacher, which is not invariable, of helping others along the same way. In Sufi literature, the theme of the search or journey is one usual convention, whether in the form of a caravan of souls, or of a lover, or of a seeker after truth. In Sufi school situations, these materials are themselves transcended as the aspirants get behind and beyond the significance of the symbolism which successively helps and then can hinder if retained too long. The system is thus very similar to the situation where you may march on a visible point in order to keep in a straight line, only to abandon it when it has fulfilled its function, choosing another, and if necessary yet another, until the goal is reached. The experience is not only one of self-realization, but one which enables the Sufi to understand what elements in this earthly abode of relative truth may conduce towards enlightenment. The real thing is brought back into the world and rendered in approximate but effective terms. The perfect, according to the Sufis, exists in other dimensions than our own, but its local form, an approximation, leading us to it, is manifested everywhere. Hence such sayings among the Sufis as, ordinary love is the temporal equivalence of real love, and the created is the indication of the creator. The scientist or other researcher, of course, may often have a similar attitude when his motivation is to start with what is known or seen, and he works backwards to its earlier phases, even, if he can, to its origin. The deep desire of the human being, so often seen, to seek the origin of all is, of course, held to be due to the fact everything returns to its origin. Jalaluddin Rumi, 700 years ago, wrote a poem in which he speaks of the evolution of man and the development through which he may rejoin his origins, an evolution which is a path retraced, as one might call it, by pushing his consciousness forward by the exclusion of limiting factors and the inclusion of others, to a destiny which is generally referred to as beyond the stars. Above the skies. We are above the skies and more than angels. Although we have descended here, let us speed back. What place is this? Every form you see has its archetype in the placeless. From that instant when you came down into the world as it is, of being, placed before you to get out was a ladder. First you were mineral, afterwards vegetable. What you then became was animal, although this is hidden from you. From that you became humankind, with knowledge, intellect, and belief. After this earth, from then your place is the sky. This has delighted the flying saucer people, whose position you will be able to judge from my earlier remarks about early and facile stabilization of systems. Sufi psychology, then, can only function in the presence of an awareness of the unity of all creation, and of creation with all existence, and all existence with something eternal. It need not, and perhaps should not, be denied that the words and actions of the Sufis have always alluded to a cosmic plan of which humanity is a part. Human communities are seen as a part of that plan, religions as instruments of the plan, yet all forms of knowledge are admitted as related, more or less directly, to the same plan. The role of the Sufi, and the Sufi is the name for the realized man or woman, not for the mere seeker after truth. You can't have a Sufi who is still learning any more than all medical students are doctors, is seen as nothing less than an instrument of the plan, but as a conscious instrument, not as a well-wisher or hero, not as a follower or optimist, not as an idealist, or even as a dedicated monk. Higher concepts. His role is naturally sometimes put in very dramatic form, He is the human being who is capable of being independent of fear of loss and desire for gain alike. Such a person alone, it is insisted, can discharge functions which would be completely beyond the ordinary person, trapped by the stick and carrot of familiar existence. He, or she, has wider choices, though often in different areas, than other people. This kind of thinking, naturally enough, is heartily disliked by those who trade only in reward and punishment, or who believe that ignorance is man's lot, and even, some of them, that hope and fear alone are his glory. These are, however, the people and states of mind whom the Sufi sees as the barrier between man's potential and his actual state, and who, in turn, imagine, against the evidence it must be stated, that the Sufi enterprise is one motivated by delusions of grandeur or a desire for power. They point to this kind of poem, which hits at lesser aspirations and hints at a greater, ordinarily almost undreamt of function of humankind. In cell and cloister, in monastery and synagogue, here one fears hell, another dreams of paradise. But whoever knows the true secrets of his God has planted no such seeds within his heart. Omar Khayyam. This is enough to set the superficialists off into orgies of accusations of irreligion against the Sufis. In one passage, though it is far from being the only one on this subject, Rumi in just a few lines makes the following statements, quite unusual, as I think you will agree, for 700 years ago. Humanity is sprung from the sea. Humanity belongs above the skies. Having descended to earth, he must try to return. He should not waste time on what are really circuses. There is not a continuous sound or tone or call calling one back. Each of these statements is interesting, each has a use, but all belong to the technical, not the narrative literature. The Sufi must be able to alternate his thought between the relative and the absolute, the approximate and the real. A major item in Sufi thought, therefore, is that there is an absolute from which ordinarily perceptible things are to be regarded as local concretizations. This is why to attach oneself to secondary things, and to be unable to detach, inhibits potentiality to progress towards perception of this absolute. This, in short, is encapsulated in the Sufi aphorism, Al-Mujazu Kantarat al-Hakika. The relative is a channel to the truth. Interplay. One of the interesting possibilities before us, due to the recent advance in knowledge of the tendency to hemispheric specialization in the brain, is that in its concepts we have a language in which to express things which we did not have before. Until recently, the balancing of the supposed opposite activity of the intellect and emotions answered well enough, and we still can use those metaphors for many purposes. With the awareness that many intellectual activities are, indeed, linked with emotions, and that emotional activity is also affected by intellection, this language has become less useful. The two-mode brain theory is useful as a hypothesis from which one can go further, certainly in the interplay of the more or less specific and the relatively abstract. The stimulus of the holistic mode of the brain is undoubtedly something which can be assigned to certain Sufic procedures, and so also can stimuli which might be applied to the sequential side. Let us look, as an example, at specialized poetry as used by the Sufis. If we ignore, for the moment, the shock effect, in the cultural sense, of the irreligious sentiments seemingly being expressed here by the great saint Jalaluddin Rumi, we can see the driving, almost, of the holistic image-forming part of the brain through the unusual employment of the verbal analytical side in this piece of poetry. In Persian, it is many times more powerful in its artistic quality. where sound and symbol and feeling are so powerfully brought together. "How is this to be handled, O Muslims?" he says. "For I do not know myself. Neither Christian nor Jew am I, not fire worshipper nor Muslim, neither Easterner nor Westerner, not of the land or of the sea, not of this world nor of the next, neither of heaven or of hell. My place is placeless. My aim is without aim. There is no body, there is no soul, for I am from the soul of souls." Though seemingly linear in expression, the effect could hardly be more unlinear. The shock element. Outward formulation, as Rumi seeks to emphasize here, however valuable in some ways, is not the essence of truth. The shock element, in which, in a highly structured and devout society such as we do not often see nowadays, he denies all customary attachments, cries out for that which lies beyond the assumed essentials, the accepted norms, the unexamined conventional wisdoms, the things people try to hold on to, believing them to be ultimates, or to be suitable substitutes for ultimates. This message, in action and in the Sufi situation, does indeed have this effect. What it succeeds in doing, of course, when read by merely formal thinkers or literalists, that covers most people, is to make them imagine that he does not know what he is doing, that he is an apostate, or that he is making poetry by rhyming without regard to the meaning of words. When it is indulged in just to shock oneself or others, it has no Sufic psychological effect, however clever or progressive it is imagined to be. When I want a good laugh, I sometimes pick up one or other of the academic monographs in which someone tries to work out at what stage in Rumi's spiritual development he went through the phase of irreligion. And yet such quotations as this, and its scholastic or amateur echoes, form only a fragment of the huge Sufi range of ideas, and hence the raw material of learning in an authentic Sufi atmosphere. The tremendous quantity and variety of the accretions to Sufi matters which have occurred during the past 1,000 years or so alone have thus naturally built up, here and there, a massively distorted picture of who the Sufis are and what they have been doing and saying. This situation has, indeed, gone so far that, as I have already mentioned elsewhere, there are parts of the East in which the amazing eccentricities and extravagant misunderstandings of Sufi thought and practice by self-appointed interpreters have fathered shallow, mimetic organizations which are so powerful in their effect on the mass mind that they are actually imagined to be the real thing by the most sincere people who have had no opportunity to learn the real facts. Luckily, this is almost always only in localized forms, and any overall study of the literature on the part of people prepared to take the trouble, few people do, easily shows that these admittedly dramatic but quite misleading groups cannot contain what we call Sufis, or be carrying on the Sufi studies of the classical literature and viable schools, and their extension into the present day, in a Sufic manner.
This podcast is copyright 2018, the Idries Shah Foundation.